Okay, so the final data source we're going to look at today is the National Housing Preservation Database, which is maintained by the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation, or PARC as it's commonly known. And so what the Housing Preservation Database, or NHPD, does is it tracks all of the federally subsidized housing units across the country. And it's really rich, and it's really, I think, as you can probably imagine, a really great source of understanding housing conditions in your community, understanding where the subsidized units are, what types of subsidies they have, and for those subsidies that expire, when those subsidies are planned to expire. So subsidies like tax credits, which expire after 20 years, it's good for planning that out as well. And so this is what the database looks like. So once again, we're going to filter in order to get down to Allen County, Ohio. But you could filter to whatever community. You can see you can filter by city, by state, by zip code, by county as well. It's also important to filter, depending on what you're interested in, whether they're active or inactive subsidies as well. And so once you have your filters set up, you can export the grid. I tend to like to export subsidies as opposed to export properties. Subsidies tend to get you more results, and I think more useful results as well. So once you have that downloaded, you can open it. And so once you have the file open, as you can see here, we've got all of these properties, which looks very daunting to, I'd say, the outside viewer. What's important, though, to know that the Housing Preservation Database does track is for most properties it tracks the latitude and longitude. And so that's very important in terms of geocoding the eventual data. So in order to get it into ArcMap, what you need to do is you need to save this as a CSV file, not as an Excel file, but as a CSV file. And then ArcMap has the capability to geocode as soon as you get it into ArcMap as a CSV. And so I'm going to do that right now. And so here we are back at the ArcMap Online interface, the old one, because I like the old one better. So we're going to add layer from file. So we're going to browse for our CSV file. So I've got my CSV right here, which is just the file that we saw, just saved as a CSV. I'm going to import it. Sometimes ArcMap doesn't like certain characters, ampersands or different symbols, but shouldn't be that much of an issue. And so voila! So you can see ArcMap relied on the geographic coordinates. And so here we go. So we can show, for instance, assisted units. So these are the number of subsidized units in each property. There's different ways you can visualize it. You can do heat maps if you want. You can do sizes. So I've got size here where each property, depending on the number of assisted units, they're larger or smaller. You can see the legends down here. You can also do colors, depending, let's say if we want to show the subsidy type. That's something that we can do. So there's a lot of different visualizations. So you see here the different subsidy types. So we've got Section 8, we've got tax credits, we got HUD insured, we have home properties, we have Section 515 rural housing, and then we also have public housing properties within the county. And so what you can do once you have this in ArcMap is you can take all the different shape files you can add, like we did in the previous demo, in terms of creating visualizations like that. And it's really a very powerful tool, I think, particularly for agencies that don't have access to ArcGIS Desktop. The fact that ArcMap Online can geocode on the free version up to 250 observations and more if you have the paid version of it. But it's a really powerful tool, and I think really useful for a lot of smaller agencies that maybe have to rely on ArcGIS Online. If you do have address data, which ArcMap can also geocode, or latitude, longitude, which will tend to geocode automatically like it did here. So it's a really powerful tool and really useful for smaller agencies as they work with data that they want to put on a map. And so I'm sure many of you on the call are very familiar with story maps, which have been around for a number of years and are a really powerful tool to take spatial data or to take any data that you're mapping and to pair it with words or images or other types of media in order to make a really big impact on your audiences. For those of you, though, who have not done story maps in recent months or in the past year or so, Esri, which is the company that owns ArcGIS, has recently done a fairly dramatic change to the interface in terms of how they work. And so what I've done is I've taken that NHPD data that we were just working with on a basic map viewer, And I've created two story maps, one in the classic story map format, which many of you might be familiar with, which Esri still allows you to create, but they're no longer supporting it. And it's unclear how long they will support it, and it's also kind of tough to find. But if you just Google classic story maps, you can find it. And the other on the newer format as well. So I'm going to show you both. So this is a layout that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you've made story maps, it's a fairly standard way of layering data, which I think is a really powerful tool. So what I've started here are the subsidized properties in Allen County, and you can see many of them are concentrated in the city of Lima. I've then layered on the qualified census tracts, which some of you are probably aware are those tracts that where, because of federal regulations, particularly around the tax credit program, it's very easy to develop affordable housing in those tracts. And they also overlap very nicely with high poverty areas. So the fact that our federal housing policy has encouraged development of affordable housing units in high poverty areas, it's really a very debatable topic, certainly a very controversial topic. And a lot of folks now are saying that we need to work to deconcentrate poverty, that we need to develop programs that will build affordable housing outside of those tracts, those qualified census tracts. And so through the layering process, I've also added on the jobs proximity index, which is something that HUD creates for areas that have a higher proximity to jobs, which I think many of you would agree are places where we should probably be prioritizing the development of affordable housing. And so you can see here there's some areas east of Lima and northwest of Lima, as well as some areas in the outlying communities which would be pretty ripe for affordable housing development. And so again, this is the classic story map interface. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but I really like how in this classic interface it makes the layering straightforward, where you can start with one piece of information, you can add in another piece of information, then you can add in a final piece of information, so folks aren't having to look at one map, and you can kind of guide them for how they interpret that map as well. So in terms of the newer story map format, so this is one that I created with the same data. It's much more linear in terms of how it's created, particularly for free users, and it's much more text heavy in terms of how it works, or can be much more text heavy. And I would argue that there are fewer customizations available as well, but again, it's still a very powerful tool for how to create a story map. And so you're kind of forced into this layout of scrolling down. This is all the same text that I had in the other story map as well. And so here again is our first map of just the subsidized housing properties. You can click, and I've got pop-ups. I should have showed you this for the previous one. Here's the second map with the properties and the qualified census tracts. One thing that I do like about the newer version of story maps is it's much easier to essentially force the zoom of a single map into a certain feature. With the classic story maps, I felt like you were forced in a lot of ways to use the same perspective, but with the newer version, it's much easier, like on this, where all the qualified census tracts are in pretty much the same part of the county. It's much easier to essentially force the gaze into that and to make the visualization a lot nicer. And then here's the final map, which we just saw as well. So again, the same kind of principles. They're forcing you into kind of the same layout for all of your story maps, which is probably I'm less of a fan of. And I think some of the customizations, particularly around branding, are a bit more limited, especially in the free version. But again, story maps still a really powerful tool for visualization purposes, particularly when you've got GIS data and other types of data that you want to incorporate into visualization.